This is the Project Management Podcast. We bring project management topics to beginners and experts. Find us on the web at www.thepmpodcast.com or send your emails to pmpodcast@gmail.com.
Hello and welcome to episode number 122. I am Cornelius Fichtner. This is the Project Management Podcast for the 5th of July 2009. Nice to have you with us. Are you working in a project management office or are you currently trying to set one up? Well, wouldn't it be great if you could read the lessons learned files of over 20 PMO executives and subject matter experts and learn from their experience? Well, we can help you. In today's episode, we welcome Mark Perry from BOT International, who is the author of the book Business Driven PMO Setup. In this book, Mark merges his personal experience of working with around 100 PMOs worldwide with the knowledge of over 20 other PMO experts from around the world. The book challenges various traditional approaches and strategies for the PMO and will show you how to implement a PMO using an extensively proven roadmap that is adaptable to any type of size or organization. And yes, you can of course win one of these books. But first, you may have wondered where last week's episode was, because there was silence on the channel here. Well, that episode had a cold and it was in bed. Or rather, I had a cold and I was in bed for about a week. Today is the first day that I'm feeling a little better, and that is why we are a week late in our schedule. But if all goes well and if the medication helps, then we should be back on track now. But even though I had that cold, I pulled myself together for you on Tuesday and did the interview with Mark. And if you listen closely, you can even hear that I wasn't feeling too great when we did this. Mark has also given us 2 copies of Business Driven PMO Setup. If you would like to win one of these copies, then please send an email to pmpodcast@gmail.com. Put Perry, P-E-R-R-Y, as the subject of your email. Tell me your hometown and country where you are writing from in the body, and make sure that your email reaches me before July 15th, 2009. And you might be the lucky one. Of course, as always, a second copy of Mark's book is reserved for our premium listeners. So if you are a premium listener, you are automatically entered and you can win a copy as well. Premium listeners who would like to double their chances, just go ahead and send an email as well. And now, let's move on to our main interview with Mark Perry on Business-Driven PMO Setup. In 1999, Mark Perry founded BOT International, a firm specializing in PMO setup with its PMO setup offering called Processes on Demand. BOT is celebrating its 10-year anniversary, and Mark has implemented Processes on Demand in more than 100 PMOs in North America, Asia Pacific, Europe, and Latin America. Largely as a result of years of experience in PMO setup work with companies, organizations, and talented project management practitioners of all disciplines, Mark has gained a wealth of knowledge, experience, relationships, and insights in the practical application of project portfolio management applications, collaboration platforms, and PMO content assets. And it is these things that he masterfully crafted into his new book, Business-Driven PMO Setup. Enjoy the interview.
Project Management Podcasts Feature Interview. Today with Mark Perry, Vice President of BOT International and author of Business-Driven PMO Setup. Practical insights, techniques, and case examples for ensuring success.
Hello, Mark, and welcome back to the program.
It's a pleasure to be back, Cornelius.
Wonderful. So, your first book is out. Congratulations on that. It's called Business-Driven PMO Setup. I have it right here. Nice book, hardcover. And it's, of course, now available in most online bookstores. So tell me, how does it feel to be a published author?
I was encouraged to write this book about 4 years ago, and it's been on my to-do list ever since. So it really feels good to have seen this idea through.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, it's almost close to 500 pages long. It's amazing, and it's quite different from other books in the same space, in the PMO space, because this is a collaborative project with many co-authors. Tell us, how did this idea come to be? Who pushed you towards this?
Cornelius, that's a great question, and I'm really glad that you asked that first. To start with, I don't want to try or want to be perceived as any kind of a PMO expert or know-it-all. I've just been fortunate to have a job and be in the position to have worked with hundreds of PMOs in the last 10 years, and more importantly, to just gain so much and learn so much by the people I've worked with, various PMO managers, IT directors, and you work with the same kinds of folks. And so from the very beginning, I realized that it's not what I know, but it's this practical insights from hundreds of folks that I've worked with to set up a successful PMO and to find out ways to deliver value and, of course, avoid having execution difficulties. So from the very beginning of the book, I had envisioned a participation from a collection of folks, PMO managers, executives to whom the PMO reports, vendor experts who serve PMOs, and fortunately, the publisher that I worked with on this book project, saw the value in that and was very supportive in what it takes to do that type of a collaborative book.
Right. And just to be absolutely clear on this, you wrote part of this book and your collaborators wrote other parts of this book, right?
That's exactly right. The book's about 500 pages. It consists of 13 chapters. Each chapter, I wrote that covers topics that every PMO will face. And the theme of the book, of course, is business-driven PMO setup. So the chapters really cover a set of topics that guide the PMO to having a business-driven focus versus a focus that sometimes unintentionally can be more aligned to standards or opinions or to other such motivations that, without too much effort, can become a distraction and off the path. And without going into the names, we had about 21 contributors from all over the world. John Malik in Singapore, Erhard Zing in Zurich, Osama Bakur in Saudi Arabia, another wonderful gentleman, Jimmy Char in Romania, a number of U.S.-based folks that are PMO managers or serve PMOs in one way or the other or have PMOs reporting to them. So it's a blended perspective, and one of the things that's neat about this blended perspective is, though all of us come from different backgrounds, different skill sets, and have different positions, we all pretty much were echoing a common refrain, and that is the need for a PMO to be business-driven.
The subtitle of your book is Practical Insights, Techniques and Case Examples for Ensuring Success. Let's take a closer look at this because we have a second interview scheduled, and in the second interview, we are going to talk more about the business-driven PMO setup and what exactly you mean by this. So we'll focus that on in our second interview here. But now let's focus on the subtitle here. So tell me, what are some of these practical insights that you talk about in your book?
Great question. So at a high level, the book presents these practical insights in an organized way. And the 13 chapters of the book provide, the organization for these insights. Chapter 1 talks about mission, goals, and objectives being business-driven versus theory-driven. Chapter 2 is about organization being constituent-oriented versus inwardly focused. Chapter 3 about managing projects with a process-oriented versus a methodology-oriented mindset. Chapter 4 talks about the need for the PMO to embrace flexibility versus mandating conformance. Chapter 5 talks about PMO tools, the need to establish a PMO architecture versus implementing a tool mindset. Chapter 6, keeping it simple in terms of executive reporting, the need to keep things simple. Chapter 7 talks about PMO leadership and introduces a technique that we call MBWA 2.0, which is a very, very nice read. Chapter 8 talks about project management leadership and espouses a servant leader approach in the project management context as opposed to the subject matter expert know-it-all. Chapter 9, creating high-performance teams. Project managers are by definition very good high performers, but sometimes there can be challenges in creating high-performance project managers and project teams. Chapter 10 talks about a practical roadmap for establishing a PMO. Again, all PMOs face this issue of how do you get established in a sensible way versus trying to be too ultra-strategic that just simply won't work at the on-site, or being too report-oriented that may be not enough value at the onset. Chapter 11 talks about line of business PMOs and the idea that PMOs are not just limited to the formal IT department or a strategic position, that PMOs are found throughout the enterprise. Chapter 12 was a real nice chapter talking about advancing organizational project management maturity, and has some very nice OPM3 case studies that are really based upon practical adoption versus just a theoretical assessment. And chapter 13 talks about PMO passion, which is extremely important to sustain the momentum and enthusiasm of the PMO. And of course, I have a wonderful contributing author in chapter 13, none other than you yourself, Cornelius Fichtner.
Yeah, I've heard of him, yes.
but anyway, so all in all, this book is about 500 pages, but it's not a handbook or reference book. It is a very practical and enjoyable read. In fact, you'll think that you're reading a novel more than a project management textbook. And if you're a project manager or in a PMO or someone that the PMO reports to, you will find this book, quite frankly, to be a page turner, and you'll find yourself relating to the many insights and case examples that are provided in the book.
Now that I'm looking at these chapters a little bit more in detail, you're really taking people right through the process of setting up a PMO. Would you suggest that somebody who's just on the onset of creating a PMO could use this sort of as a general roadmap?
Yeah, absolutely. It could be a general roadmap and a great reference for someone setting up a PMO. In particular, in Chapter 2, where it talks about constituent-oriented versus inwardly focused PMOs, it challenges a lot of the so-called experts or the formal project management community and the approaches that for far too long have failed and will continue to fail. So for someone setting up a new PMO, let me tell you, there's all sorts of ways to become distracted and focused on other things other than what the business needs. And this would be a great read for someone to see, and there's a good case example on a company that decided to form a PMO. They were looking to interview candidates. They shortlisted 2 great candidates, one a PMP certified project management professional that had been a PMO manager in 3 other companies, another, a very good candidate with skills pertinent to the company, but had not been a PMO manager before, nor was PMP certified. And in this case example, based on a true story, the company hired the PMP certified former PMO manager, and the efforts that ensued resulted in a tremendous failure of the PMO because it just wasn't aligned to the needs of the business. It was aligned more to standards and what worked at other places and theoretical kinds of PMO models. And in this company's case, after the first year point and the PMO manager left, they were actually able to hire that other shortlisted candidate that they liked. And this person had a tremendous success and had a completely different approach to setting up the PMO. So you're absolutely right on. For those setting up a new PMO, this book will be a guidebook for what to do and what not to do. And for those seeking to refresh or maybe take the PMO to the next level, this book may shed some insights on some of the common problems that PMOs have in evolving and maturing, because while there's some room for the formal maturity models that are out there, the reality is most organizations need to have those formal and academic and theoretical approaches tempered with sensible business and financial judgments.
If you had to pick a number, what would you say? How many of those case studies do you have in your book, roughly?
Well, I would say in terms of case studies and examples, there's probably 30 or 40 in the chapters that I wrote that are little vignettes. And then, of course, we have the end of chapter contributor pieces that are provided by the authors that are also what we call executive insights that provide, if you will, a more detailed case example. And there's 21 of those. So the book is littered with case examples, insights, and analogies that as you read, you'll just be scratching your head saying, I knew that person, or I knew that organization, or aha. So there's a lot of aha moments, and I think the readers will really enjoy the novel-like flow of the book.
Wonderful. In your subtitle, you also say that it contains techniques. So, out of these 500 pages, pick maybe one or two of your favorite techniques that you write about and tell us about those.
Well, that's really hard to do, picking just two. I'm fond of a number of them, and they're not necessarily my techniques, but things that I've just learned from others. But if I had to just pick two, I would say the technique for the PMO of being business-driven versus theory-driven, as guided by the 5-dimensional project management music model presented in Chapter 1, is my favorite. Mm-hmm. The music model presents 5 dimensions of project management, much like the physical dimensions, where you have a line, a plane, a 3rd dimension, 4th dimension. And the 5 dimensions that are presented in this model are the myopic division, ubiquitous, the size dimension, the intervals of time, and the chance. And, of course, that makes the acronym MUSIC. And they exist. And being aware of these dimensions help the PMO optimize the strategies and tactics of the PMO. And, also important to note, this model challenges the traditional inside-the-box thinking about project management and PMOs, calls into question, disputes much of the formal thinking about PMOs that, as I mentioned before, sometimes is rooted in theory but doesn't necessarily translate to practice. I suspect the second technique that I would pick, and we talked about this a little bit before, is the constituent-oriented versus inwardly focused technique. Being constituent-oriented, having a relentless focus on the needs of the book. This is presented at length in Chapter 2. It presents the many reasons why PMOs can become inwardly focused almost inadvertently. It discusses the unintended consequences of standards, such as the PMP, and how they can often result in more inward focus on project management and the PMO as an organization, perhaps that's more interested in aligning to the latest of PM community standards than aligning to the specific needs of the constituents that may not be as sexy or as interesting or as compelling. And that's the challenge, because some business entities may have a very defined set of needs that a PMO needs to address, and sometimes a PMO manager may want to do far more. So it's very important to target the strategy of the PMO to what the constituents need and can absorb, and of course grow that over time, versus advancing things that are just beyond the level of doability.
Okay, and just so that I'm clear on this, by constituent-oriented, we're talking about have your PMO focus on the needs of the people whom you're serving and not have them focus on the needs of the people who are working in the PMO, right?
That's exactly right. The idea being that a constituent-oriented PMO is all about focusing on the people for whom the PMO exists in the first place.
Right.
And that's an interesting concept. And spinning off on that concept, also presented in that chapter, is the discussion that you should never sell the PMO. You never hear a vice president of sales selling why we need a sales organization, or a vice president of marketing selling why we need a marketing organization, or an accounting executive selling why we need a finance department. You don't need to sell the PMO. When you sell the PMO, you get a weak foundation. You don't get buy-in. Rather, what you want to do is to have the PMO constituents specify the goals and objectives that they need the PMO to achieve. And then, of course, the PMO develops the strategy to meet the goals and objectives of the constituents. In that way, the constituents agree with the strategy, support the strategy, and buy into it because it's their strategy, their PMO, right, not some mid-office organization building a center of excellence that may be well-intended, but may be a lot of activity and effort on the periphery of business needs.
All right. Let's move along, because earlier on you talked about an acronym that you use in your book, and I'd like you to define the term and explain us how this helps in setting up a PMO. And the acronym that we're talking about is MBWA 2.0. MBWA 2.0. What does it mean and how does it help me?
Sure. MBWA is a term that refers to management by walking around. Some people refer to it as managing by wandering around. The term's not important in terms of the words, but MBWA is a time-tested technique that's been around for years and years. Some people credit this technique to Hewlett-Packard. As you may know, Tom Peters popularized it in his book, In Search of Excellence. And, of course, military leaders going back to the times of the Roman army exhibited this leadership, where Roman army generals would walk around the night before a battle and mingle with the troops. But let me tell you about my first experience with MBWA, because it is one of the reasons I believe in it and believe it has a fit in the PMO. I learned about MBWA as a first-line manager in IBM, but years before formally learning about it, I had it done to me in 1983. I was account manager, and on one fine Wednesday, prime rib day at my customer's cafeteria, I was having lunch with the program manager of the company that was my point of contact for the account. We were having our weekly staff meeting, discussing ideas, making plans for the up-and-coming quarter, and all of a sudden, this well-dressed gentleman sat down and joined us. And Cornelius, he didn't need an introduction. He asked us for our names. He went on to ask us, what are we doing? What's our goals? What are our objectives? Where do we stand year to date? And he listened attentively, and he offered a lot of ideas and praise for what we did well and suggestions for what we were having troubles with. And this was not disinterested chit-chat. This was really an intense, useful working discussion. And after lunch, he gave me his card and told me that if I ever need help working with his company, just to give him a call. Who was that man? It was Ross Perot, the CEO of the company, EDS. And after Ross left, the customer contact and I continued our meeting, and I can't tell you how full of energy and enthusiasm we were having Ross spend 45 minutes with us over lunchtime. And that's the impact, that a leader can have on followers using managing by walking around technique. But unlike the corporate days of 25 years ago, where everyone worked in a physical location and could meet having a cup of coffee at the coffee lounge or at the cafeteria, today's knowledge workers are scattered everywhere. Remote locations, home offices, customer sites, in organizational matrix silos. And it's very, very difficult to just walk around, hence the need for MBWA 2.0. So this updated model suggests that we need to refresh the concept, perhaps introduce some situational leadership, and introduce the concept of Web 2.0 techniques that foster PMO leadership, such as wikis, social software, blogs, social networks, podcasting, RSS feeds, and using Web 2.0 tools. Everyone's asking, how do we use these techniques effectively? But what's missing is a wrapper, or what's missing is a overall theme that says, here's a way to use these techniques. So MBWA 2.0 basically says, let's take the time-tested value of management by walking around and extend upon it with these new things, such as the Web 2.0 techniques and tools that are available. And at the end of the day, PMOs are leadership organizations, naturally. And project managers and PMO managers are natural leaders, and I believe natural servant leaders. But far too often, the PMO, and specifically the PMO manager, can become so wrapped up in daily activities and meetings that so many leadership opportunities are missed. So for any project manager or PMO manager seeking to hone their leadership skills, this particular chapter and this idea of managing by walking around 2.0, as well as the chapter that follows on PMO servant leadership, are simply must-reads.
Okay, I get it. So this is very interesting because in the last couple of episodes that I had on the podcast, we talked a lot about how to use these new tools, social media, project management 2.0, in an actual environment, in an actual project environment. And I haven't really heard a lot about, how you can really implement these. So I have to admit, I haven't read that chapter in the book yet. So I'm going to go back through it and see whether or not it's going to give me some really helpful ways of using social media and project management 2.0 in running my project. So I'm looking forward to that.
Well, you're a great example because I can't tell you how many PMOs I've worked with that subscribe to the Project Management Prepcast. And many times, and I can't tell you how many folks have told me that over their lunch meetings that, not every episode, but when they have their monthly staff meetings, there may be a project management prepcast that talks about a topic that they're struggling with or a topic they want to know more about. So for many project management offices, what greater way to participate in management by walking around in social media than to use the available techniques that are out there. So even though you've not physically walked around to all these PMOs around the world or the United States, I can assure you there's a number of folks that have benefited and have benefited by your participation via your podcast, which is an example of getting out there vis-a-vis this new I wouldn't, well, you could call it Web 2.0. I mean, it's a podcast, but the new techniques surrounding podcasts enable you to be in places that you just simply couldn't get on an airplane and go off to.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right, here's my last question for you, and it's all about the last chapter in your book. Tell me, why are you so passionate about PMOs?
That's a great question. Like many PMO enthusiasts, my passion for PMOs was birthed out of practical experience, not out of study, not out of learning or reading a book or belonging to an association, but out of practical experience. I suspect yours has been too.
Yes.
And in my case, this was over 25 years ago. The year was 1982. I was with IBM at the time in the Dallas branch office of the data processing division. We were the mainframe guys. In fact, we had two models. If it don't drink, it don't think. That was our mainframe motto. The other motto we had was, if God had wanted us to have brains, if God had believed in distributed computing, he would have put brains in our wrists. I mean, so if you could espouse those two models, you were a mainframe guy. But anyway, I was called upon our branch manager to lead a departmental PMO. And the mission of this PMO was totally business driven. It was to support the new financial strategy of IBM back in 1982 to achieve a revenue objective and a complete revenue transformation. Back then, IBM didn't sell mainframes; it rented them. Mm-hmm. And without going into the details, the company needed to completely change its financial model to keep up with the competitive realities. And this particular innovative branch manager chose to form a PMO to do just that. And I wrote about this story in the book, but the key point and the moral of the story was that this visionary branch manager that decided to have a PMO in his branch, and by the way, he was only one out of 250 branch managers that did so, but he did so not to do a better job of project management, not to adopt a standard, not to promote the profession of project management within his group. Rather, the sole purpose and focus of the PMO was to achieve the revenue goals and objectives of the branch office, period. Now, of course, we reviewed project plans. We had about 75 different projects that we did in the first year. We reviewed tasks, issues, resolved issues, implemented tools, and implemented some methodologies. But all of these things were supportive to the reason for having the PMO. They were not the reason for the PMO on themselves. So in conclusion of this story, the PMO was a tremendous success. The branch office objective was exceeded by $20 million. It was a $250 million branch. It achieved $20 million more than the quota. The rank of the branch for that measurement period of the year was the number one branch in total revenue as well as percent of revenue. And that experience really started for me what's become a career-long passion for PMOs and a deep appreciation that PMOs can exist in many places throughout an organization, not just IT or near IT. And also a deep appreciation that in order to achieve success, PMOs really need to be driven by the needs of the business for which they're created. All other motivations, influences, and desires are secondary and sometimes even irrelevant. And I might add that despite all the years of incorrect and bad advice from the formal project management community about PMOs and PMO models, at the end of the day, there's really only two kinds of PMOs. I always get asked, tell me about the PMO models. And I like to advocate there's two kinds of PMOs and only two kinds of PMOs. The PMO that's driven by the needs of the business, for which the PMO was created and exists to serve, and the PMOs that are not. So all this talk about control towers and weather stations and fighter squadrons is just irrelevant, theoretical mumbo jumbo. You either have a PMO that is driven by the needs of the business, or you don't, and those are the two PMO models.
Excellent. Once again, the book is called Business Driven PMO Setup. It is written by Mark Price Perry, and it is published through J. Ross Publishing, of course available in many, many online bookstores. And let's also not forget that Mark Perry is also the host of the PMO podcast, which you can find at thepmopodcast.com. Mark, thank you so much for your time and presenting your book here on the program. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Cornelius.
And that was our interview with Mark Perry on his new book, Business Driven PMO Setup. That's it for today. Thank you very much for listening. Please don't forget, send an email to pmpodcast@gmail.com with Perry as your subject if you would like to win a copy of Mark's book. And if you do like our podcast, then please forward it to your friends, co-workers, project management colleagues, or anyone who might enjoy it. As always, you can find us on the web at thepmpodcast.com. If you are a project manager who wants to become a PMP, then the easiest way is to do so with our sister podcast, the Project Management Prepcast, and study for the exam by watching over 38 hours of video training from pmprepcast.com. And if you are already a PMP, then stop by at pmlectures.com. Here we go beyond just delivering PDUs. We give you exclusive training from the brightest minds in project management today. Please send your emails to pmpodcast@gmail.com, and when you write, please tell me where in the world you are writing from. And finally, we have this. Project meetings are events in which minutes are kept and hours are lost. Until next time.